Our speakers across the floor respect those. I know there's no obligation to do so. However, just for decorum's sake, we ask that POI preferences are respected. Lastly, I know this is an out round. However, just please put your names in the chat please, just so we know who we're talking to in that particular regard. Are there any questions before we start? Okay. If there are no questions before we start, I think we can start. In the motion, this House regrets the dominance of quantitative easing as a tool for economic stabilization post-COVID-19. Prime Minister, whenever you're ready to open a case, and if one which stands in your name. Here, here.
Am I audible?
Yep, you're audible.
Right. Just setting up my timer. But as I'm doing that, my POI prefaces, I want them to be verbal. So if you have a POI, don't hesitate to unmute and ask. All right. I think this should be ready now. Give me a moment. Okay. It should work then. Amazing stuff. All right. So let's begin this debate then. Okay. The chair, after COVID, the world panicked. Businesses closed, dropped.
Sorry, speaker, just give me a second. Debate Institute Africa, please mute.
Yeah, I've
Debate
muted them.
Institute Africa. I still hear him on my end. I don't know if it's just me.
Oh. Let me see if I can mute him.
Okay. Great.
Okay.
Great stuff. Thank you so much. Prime Minister, I'm so sorry about that. You may restart your speech if you so please.
All right. So restarting my speech. The chair, after COVID, the world panicked. Businesses closed, jobs vanished, and markets trembled. So central banks responded by creating enormous amounts of money and using it to buy financial assets, government bonds, mortgage bonds, and corporate debt. This is quantitative easing. At first, it was emergency medicine, but in today's debate, it's going to be about something else. It's about what happens when that emergency medicine becomes the normal diet of the nation. And we're going to regret the dominance of quantitative easing because when you build an economy around constant central bank rescue, you do not remove risk, you reallocate it, enlarge it, and disguise it. And that is going to be very dangerous to the world that we live in. What is the counterfactual? And I'm going to be very precise about it because our world is not the one that says that we should do nothing in terms of trying to stabilize the economy. There are a number of things that we're going to do. We think first that direct government support to workers and small firms exists exclusive of quantitative easing that can happen with the amount of money governments have in their reserves or money that they can get in loans to help these things. Two, but clear financial regulation that prevents reckless leverage. And this is the action we took after the 2008 crisis, where we began to put market caps on banks. We can do that for a lot of other industries to ensure that they are stabilizing and not taking risks that destroys the economy. But three, I think you can just push for more transparent fiscal decisions where the governments are very honest about the decisions that they're making for their citizens, and so things are very clear to people. People can properly do financial planning and keep things very simple. What then is the metric of this debate? This debate is not about whether quantitative easing calmed markets in 2020, because it did. We will concede to that. But the question is whether quantitative easing being dominant after that makes the economic system safer over time. But I need to point out that in a regret motion, we're not just retrospective, we're able to do analysis of harm that can happen continuously after, because we think that the past affects the present and the future. Let's get then straight into the argument that is coming from our side. I think quantitative easing has created three things I'm going to prove: inequality, addiction, and political restraint. Let's get then into inequality. I think first, when central banks buy massive amounts of bonds, investors are going to receive the cash. Exactly. But that means the cash from these investors go to a number of places. It goes to stocks, it goes to real estate, it goes to financial assets. The problem then is, if a lot of money is going into these places because we printed a lot of money, and now that there's a lot of cash within the hands of these individuals, they have incentives to find a way to make it more valuable. Prices of these things rise. So what that means is people who already own assets become wealthier. And what it means is that if you're renting, or you're saving for your first home, or you're working paycheck, life becomes inherently more expensive. And after COVID, this happened. Stock market soared, housing market surged, especially when the Fed bought mortgage and bonds within those places. Meanwhile, the ordinary people then began to face rent issues, rising cost of living, big things that make their life incredibly hard to exist. We think them, because it made the life of the average person slightly more stressful. We regret it on that side. But we don't think that inequality is just like some cosmetic issue that you run in the data and say, oh, people don't have enough money, that's bad. I think it's particularly bad because it reduced their autonomy and made it difficult for them to go to pursue the things that make them happy, or just to survive in the first place. And that is why inequality is bad. Also, that it increased the power asymmetry that already exists in status quo, giving those who already have more power through financial assets, more power within these spaces to do things and get away with them because of the way states exist and the amount of money they put into states. But the second thing then on what it did in terms of market addiction, I think first is that markets are not passive. And that's a concession every side has to make within this debate. Markets adapt, and markets begin to operate on patterns and incentives based on what is available to them. We think then, when central banks repeatedly intervene with quantitative easing to prevent downturns, investors internalize this. What that means is that there is a market conversation that says that if things go badly, the central bank will rescue the system. And we think this has happened consistently, especially if you see the way AIFMs have been moving in status quo, and the way a lot of banks and whatnot have been moving within these big economies. So what that means is that they've been taking more risk, they've been borrowing more cheaply, and they leverage further. What has that created in most instances? It means that even when the system goes crazy, they are doing things which increases the risk of harms happening to the economies in most instances. What is the proof of this? In the United Kingdom, for instance, pension funds relied on complex bond strategies, nearly collapsed because of more risk these institutions were taking, because the banks were going to the central bank was going to intervene on their behalf. This happened in France, almost collapsed the economy, with something that we regret as well. I think then what you need to recognize here is that we don't like the behavior change that comes with this action that exists within the markets. Very simple case, very simple burden. I think it's adequately proved within this debate. But the third thing then is the political restraints. I think when central banks buy massive amounts of government debt, borrowing becomes cheap, and then governments grow accustomed to this environment. What does that mean? It means difficult fiscal choices are delayed, and structural reforms are postponed, and public spending expands without immediate visible cost. What does that lead to? Inflation then returns, interest rates rise, and suddenly the cost of debt increases again. Central banks attempt to tighten, but tightening becomes politically explosive, because then this has been the pattern of economic operation. It becomes detrimental to the way that they operate, because now governments fear rising debt servicing costs, the markets also fear assets repricing, and voters are going to fear mortgage increasing, or other financial assets they own becoming incredibly difficult for them to access. What does that mean? The central bank is no longer merely stabilizes the markets. It's now trapped between inflation control, financial stability, then political populism gains leverage, and it's not just about what is good for the economy, but then there's a balance of trying to help a particular voter base and what they want, because that friction would happen. Let us then weigh these debates then to make this very simple. I think then the idea here is that quantitative easing prevented eventual collapse of COVID, and so for some reason that's the reason why we shouldn't regret it. I don't think that is what we want on our side, because we think that even if it prevented immediate collapse, it set up a system that eventually means that we're going to have a lot of problems in the future, given the things that I've explained. The comparison here is simple. if quantitative making it dominant has made it likely that more economies are engaging this way, making it likely there's an increased incentive for market behavior this way, and making it more difficult in terms of political actions that can be taken, made it less, has made the state more likely to collapse rather than in the immediate where, like in the immediate salvation that it brought them in most instances. I think on inequality, on addiction, and the political restraint that exists within these places, we don't think that we want that to happen within this world. It's been a proud day to be Prime Minister.
Awesome. We'd like to thank the Prime Minister for those remarks. Just a reminder, POIs are very important. House thanks Prime Minister, Leader of Opposition, open the case for your team. Here.
Yeah, am I audible, Chair?
Yep, you're audible.
All right. So my name is Jeffrey. I'm going to be the leader of opposition. I'm going to take my POIs in my 4 to 5th minute. Preferably, I want to take closing government for that short diagonal. With that said, I'm going to start my next read. Just get my timer. Chair, the government paints a picture of quantitative easing as a dangerous drug that the economy got hooked on. This is fundamentally misleading because of what the real characterization of what post-COVID patient literally looks like. We think that a patient in cardiac arrest, you do not accuse them of being addicted to the defibrillator. You do not complain that the life support machine creates that dependency. You thank it for keeping the heart beating long enough for the body to literally heal. We regret nothing about the dominancy of quantitative easing because it was the only word that was standing between us and a second Great Depression 2.0. We think that's something we don't literally regret. Within OG's case means that they argue quantitative easing pumped up stock markets and housing prices, making the rich richer whilst the poor literally suffers. Our response to it is quite simple. We can see that QE raised a lot of asset prices, but let's look at the comparative. The government worries about the wealth gap. We are worried about the survival gap, and that's a clear distinction between us and OG. We think that there's a couple of things that happens here. One, the wealthy have assets. The poor have one asset, and that's their job and their labor. The mechanism to this is that one, without quantitative easing to keep credit flowing, businesses would have faced liquidity crisis. They would have stopped payroll immediately. What's that impact happening? We think that one, those who get fired first in the collapse is not the CEO, it is the factory worker, the cleaner, the service staff. We think the takeaway is that one, whilst quantitative easing made the rich richer on paper, it kept the poor unemployed. We think without, we would rather have a world with high inequality and low unemployment than have a world where the stock market is fair, but then the working class is starving because the economy has literally collapsed. That's something we probably don't want to happen. But secondly, they argue that markets and governments become lazy and dependent on cheap money, and they are not unable to function without it. We think that first thing first, they call it addiction because they call it addiction. We call it's a structural reality that happens within economic crisis. Let's contextualize dependency in today's debate. We think that post-COVID, the private sector stopped spending. It wasn't that they were lazy, they were terrified. If the central bank hadn't stepped in to be the buyer of the last resort, the bond market would have frozen. There are two things that happens here. One, the withdrawal defense. The government says that we are now dependent. Look at the status quo panel. Central banks are currently raising rates and doing quantitative tightening. We think that the economy is adapting. The fact that we are winning off it doesn't literally prove that it wasn't a medical treatment to the solution. We don't necessarily think that it's a permanent addiction. We think that post-COVID era, that was the only solution that would have happened because all other metrics literally was sorted out but didn't work. Thirdly, we think that the government claimed that states becomes dependent on cheap debt. But remember, panel, what the debt literally brought? It brought vaccines. It brought things like the fair law schemes. If dependency means relying on the central bank to fund the survival of the population during a plague, then that is a dependency we would celebrate, not literally regret. But tell you, let's literally restart the contest. Why? Because let me briefly characterize what the dominance was inevitable, contrary to what the government literally believes, right? The zero bond, right? This is quite important. As I mentioned, interest rates were already at zero. We couldn't cut them further. The psychology of panic in 2020 and 2021 meant that banks were holding cash. No matter how much you pleaded, they wouldn't lend cash to their hands. It wasn't a choice to make a dominance, as government says. It was only heavy artillery that was left for us to literally take up and battle this economic crisis. To regret this dominance is to regret that we used the only gun that literally worked within this economic crisis, right? The government regrets the side effects of the cure. They regret that the medicine better, but we on opposition look at the alternative, things like mass bankruptcy, deflation, unemployment. We say that the dominancy of quantitative easing was literally necessary. It was moral, and it saved the global economy for what we are proud to literally oppose. But then let me take a POI from closing if they have one.
Your model of quantitative easing doesn't make sense. The quantitative easing bought financial assets from banks, which lowered interest rates and stabilized markets in emergency scenarios only, but it never touched the poor. It just made the fact that they could borrow possible, but not easy nor guaranteed.
Yes, exactly. That's the reason why we are going to lose from CG. Because, see, banks were not really, like, they weren't willing to lend monies to businesses because they feared that there was going to be their currency is not literally going to hold that value. What it meant is that the moment that you pump money, the moment that you buy assets, it means that there is a pumping of money, liquidity into the market. What then that means is that banks then have an incentive to give monies to small businesses, to start up businesses, and make sure that consumerism and money circulation within the economy is at its high peak. And that is the reason why you save businesses, you save a lot of people, because government spends money on vaccines and all these kind of things. You save businesses, you save people's life post-COVID. Let's do a couple of analysis here, right? We think that the post-COVID, the economy didn't just pause, it changed. It changed, right? Businesses had to transition to remote work. Digital supply chains had to happen and renovate for health safety. This is literally important because quantitative easing kept corporate bond yields low. Companies could borrow cheaply to fund this massive transition. The thing is that, one, it wasn't addiction to cheap money. It was financing a necessary evolution. Without quantitative easing, healthy businesses would have gone bankrupt simply because they couldn't afford the cash flow to pivot on a digital post-COVID model. The impact is simple. We avoided a structural collapse of the private sector. If we had not used quantitative easing panel, we could have emerged from the pandemic with a dissolute high street and a broken industrial base that couldn't literally restart at a longer run. The reason why we are winning is because, one, we proved to you why this was the only metric of last resort to save businesses and to save government, because government had to then have money to purchase things like COVID vaccines, to save small businesses, to keep businesses afloat, especially that helps developing countries and their businesses, and even developed countries. We are proud to oppose and happy to be the leader of opposition. Here.
Awesome. Our thanks and excuses the leader of opposition for those remarks. Deputy Prime Minister, whenever you're ready to continue the case for your team. Here. DPM.
Am I audible?
Yep, you're audible.
Okay. Yeah, okay. No worries. If you guys want to ask anything, I'll check I'll ask for it because it's a bit distracting. If it's a bit distracting if If you guys are mute, so I'll just ask for it. Yeah, very happy I was able to do this with Kata. Let me just check something here. Okay, I'm going to start on my next word. See, ideally, the problem with OPCASE is that it's hinged on the fact that there is no specific solution that exists on our side. So at this point, they're only saying that there were harms that existed by specific, that the harms that exist when you regret, but they don't specifically say what harms exist when you regret. So they don't engage. So if we give companies direct loans or money, like this is something I've already talked about, would deal with the issue. So I think the idea of this thing would basically allow consumers and producers. So producers are able to, and everything I've explained allows producers to have some level of leeway, to have some level of growth, but also stability to solve the issues. This allows for consumers, and this solves most of the issues without having to specifically rely on the central bank. So what have opening opposition failed to do thus far? They failed to explain to us why at the end of the day their side was worth it, because they were able to explain that survival would have been able to happen either way, or with our counterfactual and where their lousy quantitative easing. So the idea is that at best, if you're weighing this specific case, it's a wash. But second, at the end of the day, we are marginally better because we give you specific things that first of all, reduce the burden of specific institutions, but also empower other institutions to create significant sustainable change. Second, this Our counterfactual is more sustainable because it would allow for the system to gradually stabilize, but also not be able to collapse in the long run and suffer things like inflation and other things that Andrew already talked to you specifically. I think on our side, you would have gotten. I think on our side, the world is probably a far much better world compared to what happens on their side. There is nowhere up that's far. I'll take closing off before I move on.
Yeah, so I think you have been non-comparative. You have to prove to us how your own side, would have led to better impact in terms of economic stabilization, even in the future.
Nah, bruh, I've already just done that. I'm not gonna go in it in itself. On your world, basically, right? At the end of the day, supply chains were brittle. And I wanna first extend before I engage that specific concept because it's the last thing standing. The first thing I want to extend on is basically on that distortion of like risk and zombie companies. So when quantitative easing is the dominant tool, interest rates are kept artificially low for too long. This breaks the check and balance mechanism for capitalism. Why this is true is because usually the inefficient companies fail because they can't adapt to the market, they fail to operate, not the fault of the economy, but just the company itself. It means that quantitative easing then provides cheap credit that allows unproductive firms to survive on no interest debt. So they don't grow, they are simply there on a constant, so they have to ease off workers, they have to make everybody's life better. The impact of this is that this drags down aggregate productivity and creates a debt trap where the without causing a wave of bankruptcies. The second is basically on principle, this talks about why we cater for the most vulnerable actor, but also on scale of impact, we cater for the most individuals. Because if our model caters for a scale over time and for a long time, we are more productive than upside, we cater for scale numbers, but also the most vulnerable people over a long time, but also on scale and sustainability. We are far better than them. Radical wealth inequality. I think Andrew already talked about this because quantitative easing is fundamentally regressive because it operates by inflating asset prices. The benefits accrue almost exclusively to those who already own assets. So only the rich are able to survive. I don't see why morally this makes any sense if there was already an alternative that would be better for both individuals, like we have already given to you. The moral hazard and fiscal responsibility. The dominance of quantitative easing signals to governments that they can borrow infinitely because the central bank will always be the buyer of the last resort. This removes the bond, and this talks about governments that are corrupt, governments that embezzle money. Money never reaches the common individual, so they just use the money after more people suffer. This removes the idea of governments can avoid difficult structural reforms or tax pivots. The government loses its responsibility and its social contact with the individuals. The government on our side is going to become less effective. That point is very regrettable on all forms. This is not a policy motion, it's retrospective. We regret that they have to weigh the metrics. Thanks.
Okay, awesome. Last thanks and excuses, the Deputy Prime Minister for those remarks. And now to conclude the top half, DLO, whenever you're ready. Here.
All right. I hope I'm audible enough.
Yep, you're audible.
All right. Thank you very much. So I'll take POIs. You can budget in. I'm not looking at my text space. So yeah, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Mr. Chair, the litmus test to the success of an economy is contingent on the buoyancy of their actual economies. Money is a precursor for financial and functional economies. Notice that in our world, we are able to make sure that the precursor for functional economies and investor confidence is available to resuscitate the buoyancy of the economy in the first place. Why is it particularly important? One caveat, panel, the way in which OG argued is to say that, quantitative easing is bad. But the debate primarily is about whether the dominance of quantitative easing as a tool for economic stabilization post-COVID is something that we should regret. It being a tool for economic stabilization is something that we don't get the regret metrics from the entire of Gulf, because they just seem to say quantitative easing is bad. Okay, but its dominance in stabilizing the economy post-COVID, why is that context still bad? Or why are you still regretting that context? You get nothing of that sort from them. Let's go to a lot of this ingenuity things that they did with their counterfactual. They first said that their counterfactual is going to be like, one, direct government support to businesses. It baffles me because
truly speaking, within those contexts, the context we are debating post-pandemic, where literally, like, it's literally a depression, where government literally doesn't have money and stuff like that, it is unclear how all of a sudden the government will start the debate. We are in a top room. Like, we cannot just assume that it happens without regulation and whatnot.
General,
So whatever they say at that point of, all right, you can shoot from closing or opening, whoever.
okay, so that question on our side is basically that there is a difference, because on your side, the central bank is doing everything. On our side, not everyone is. But that's also a stark contradiction from what you guys said. Survival is basically your benchmark. Now you want to talk about progression. Quantitative easing was supposed to help in emergencies. Like, you have to really do a lot of legwork to explain why it becomes a long-term thing. You can't just, use grammatical confetti to co-opt our case.
So I'm just going to make two important notice for this kind of, and before I respond to you. So, panel, notice that in quantitative easing, a large quantitative easing program sends powerful signal that the central bank is committed to keeping interest rates low for a long term. What is the impact of this? It means three things. One, it manages the public and market expectations. Why? Because it encourages borrowing, and two, it encourages spending on itself. What I want you to note is that the confidence in the market is long term. The effect and signaling effect of quantitative easing is long term. So we do get the survival that we claim, yet we still get the ripple effect of it being long term also. So they cannot just say that just because we say it's for survival, we don't get any impact from long term. Like, literally, quantitative easing literally just sends the signal that central banks are committed to keeping interest rates low for a long term. So it invites more investors. It gives confidence to investors to invest. It gives confidence to people to continue going about their things that will rejuvenate the economy and whatnot. So we still get the long term despite every other thing. But then, why is it also important? Because it is important because now that you've managed the expectations within the market, you are able to make sure that you encourage things like borrowing and spending in and out of itself. Why is it important? Because it is stabilizing the economy, it rejuvenates the economy, money moves through the economy. Why is it important? Because you are unlikely going to get businesses losing, collapsing and whatnot, because they are just engaging within the economy. Why is it important? Because they don't get to lay off workers like Google did within those particular periods of time. Why is it important? People now get to be employed. Why is it important? Poor people are in the most instances are not going to be laid off, because if there's an instance where a company has to lay off, they are laying off the poor people and not the CEOs and the stakeholders. Why is it important? We cater for the vulnerable individuals within the debate, we are able to show you how this dominance of QE, especially as a tool for economic stabilization, is the primary method to solve or to liberate poor people and still get them their jobs within those emergency situations of post-pandemic, post-COVID and whatnot. Notice, panel, all our arguments are situated within the context of economic stabilization within the post-COVID-19 era, and not just any other thing like OG claims. But then the last thing about OG's counterfactual was that they'll just ensure that there is transparent decisions and whatnot, so things are made clear to people. Am I sure that the government is hiding well, for just intuition pump? We all know about quantitative. We know it happened. We knew it happened after 2008. We know these things happen, and it is public information. Government doesn't hide information, so the counterfactual also cannot be like there's transparent whatever. People know what it's still it's still inclusive of quantitative easing. Nothing is exclusive. Thank you.
Cool. House thanks and excuses Deputy Leader of Opposition for those remarks. That brings an end to the top half of the debate. Member of Government, whenever you're ready to begin the bottom half. Here.
Hi everyone. My name's Iman, pronoun she, her. I'm just gonna quickly close this window by me quickly. Okay, can we all hear me if I speak like this?
Yep, all good.
Okay, cool. I'll take POIs verbally. Okay, cool. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Quantitative easing was an emergency response to an emergency moment. Our contribution today is about what happens when emergency power becomes normalized and why that specifically matters the most beyond markets and ultimately infiltrates democratic systems. 2 framing claims from CG. We think democracy is the meta mechanism through which societies adapt to any type of crisis. So if quantitative easing dominance erodes that mechanism, we think that all downstream outcomes after that worsen for every level of society. But secondly, what does the alternative actually look like? We think currently we'd rather have post-emergency dominant strategies instead of what OG says about keeping central banks only on interest rates. So what does that look like? It probably looks like proper fiscal legislation and policy. So that looks like maybe proper insurance for unemployment or tax deferrals in times of downturn. Or it could look like, instead of creating money to buy financial assets, maybe using that money, putting it into lending industries that make up critical supply chains. So maybe agricultural industries in Africa. What's the core stance here? We can show you that post-COVID, quantitative easing specifically, that dominance undermines democracy by doing a couple things. It hides economic risk, it weakens political accountability, but it locks society into permanent crisis governance. I want to really make it clear a unique piece of framing that I don't think has been discussed in this debate. Why specifically post-COVID makes this especially dangerous? We don't think the top half has really answered this question. Post-COVID societies face a couple unique things. Number one, high debt. Number two, fragile supply chains, like what I mentioned earlier. And then probably climate, transition costs, right? So think about all those specific dangers. So that requires specific output, so transparent risk, but also democratic negotiation, because that's who we rely on to sort out these problems. But most importantly, it means long-term planning, post-emergency. We think quantitative easing dominance specifically shortcuts those things, because it short circuits political responsibility and it normalizes emergency governance. But more importantly, it trains societies to focus on the wrong actors. So now we expect technocrats to solve distributive problems. That is a recipe for democratic decay. Think about that huge impact. A couple of reasons why we have to rank above OG. I'll try and do it quickly, but 3 main reasons. Number one, I think OG identifies outcomes mainly, but I think CG is going to explain the cause that make those things permanent. So they tell you that it increases inequality, that QE increases inequality, that assets holders benefit and the cost of living rise. All those things can be true, but OG treats those as a fix. I think CG can go a lot deeper. We're going to show you why this dominance changes who makes economic decisions in the first place, and it shifts this power from those elected institutions to those technocratic ones, and why that inequality then persists and compounds. That's really important, because you can fix inequality in a democratic system. You cannot fix inequality when decision-making authority is structurally displaced. We have to rank above OG there. But secondly, OG's harms are contingent, and we think CG's harms are much more systemic. So OG's world, if governments redistribute later, if housing policies improves, and if wages maybe catch up, then inequality can be easily mitigated in their world. Notice in CG, though, democratic accountability is hollowed out and risk is hidden rather than debated. But ultimately, political choice is permanently deferred. That means our harms don't rely on bad actors and they don't disappear with better policy design. It's ultimately permanent. I'll do a couple of responses now to OO. A lot of it's going to be integrated though. I want to say that all of OO's analysis is just why this is good in emergency period. So they tell us basically these people benefited them in detail there. That's pretty much all their analysis. They failed to actually prove why these benefits still exist beyond that temporary shock period. I don't think they can win on strategy. A couple of responses though. This first claim that it's necessary in crisis and why this means that it's justified as a dominant post-COVID tool. So the claim is basically that it like prevents collapse and bankruptcy and mass unemployment. I think the response here is that we can concede that it's necessary during COVID, but the motion regrets dominance after crisis, not emergency deployment. So if preventing immediate collapse doesn't justify then long-term reliance and treating this as the default stabilizer. If they didn't prove that, they can't really win this debate.
Okay, I've paused time.
Okay.
Suleimana, I think. Please mute. Okay, cool. So sorry, member of government.
It's okay.
I've tried to send one meeting. Is that okay?
Sorry?
I attempted to send a
Henry, you were
meeting.
saying?
Did it work?
Oh yeah, no, it's muted.
I'm saying
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, Henry. It did work. Okay, is everything okay? I stopped your time at 4:10. I don't know if Amir has the same.
Yeah, it's the same for me.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
Uh,
Cool.
you
I'll
can-
just
you can
resume
take that.
from where I was. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So I'll resume from like 4:10. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The second response is to say that this quantitative easing protects markets first, but workers only at best indirectly. So a lot of their benefits are mitigated there. So their claim is basically that businesses would fail and workers would starve. The key response here is that quantitative easing primarily stabilizes financial markets, not households. So liquidity flowed to like things like banks or like bond markets or large corporations. Who it doesn't reach is informal workers or like low income households who they want to protect. Workers were only protected only if like indirectly or very temporarily. So that's why the cost of living still rose and inequality still widened. I don't know why they just ignore that. But thirdly, I don't understand why dependency on central banks isn't a dangerous thing. If central banks are unelected, they cannot make distributed choices legitimately. They're not voted in. You can't hold them accountable. That's basically our case. Moving on to like our two main arguments here, but you'll notice like it was quite integrated to my rebuttal. Number one, on why quantitative easing dominance shifts economic power away from democratic institutions. We think economic stabilization involves like a bunch of choices, like budgetary choices, taxation decisions, and trade-offs. Quantitative easing changes this by doing 3 key things. Number one, it allows central banks to inject trillions without any sense of parliamentary approval. Secondly, it determines like winners and losers through asset purchases, not any form of legislation. But thirdly, you're moving stabilization from public debate to technocratic discretion. So this isn't like efficiency, it's depoliticization of the very people citizens vote for. So if you actually care about citizens, you're going to care about this. But secondly, it hides risks, and hiding risks removes like democratic feedback. So if QE, quantitative easing, was designed to suppress volatility during crises, then post-COVID, volatility suppression becomes permanent. So volatility normally signals economic danger. It forces governments to act and do something quickly. When QE hides that volatility, that risk appears cheaper than it is, and markets behave then as if the economy is much safer. Take an example of the South African Reserve Bank and how they began like large-scale purchases of government bonds to stabilize after that, which means that they keep borrowing to keep costs low. It functionally did the same thing. You suppress bond yields, you stabilize markets, but it makes risk ultimately look much cheaper than it is. And so we get major democratic trade-offs. And when correction finally comes, once inflation rises globally again, the SR, like the Reserve Bank, has to tighten interest rates sharply without like people consenting to have this trade-off done earlier. That weakens democratic accountability specifically, because governments can borrow cheaply without explaining this repayment. They can avoid tax reform, but citizens never get a chance to debate these trade-offs, and they only experience those consequences later as sudden crises. So at the point where backlash might come, politicians can simply blame central banks. Central banks lack any form of democratic legitimacy So public trust collapses. So it's essentially just like accountability
You all right?
about any consent there out of time. I think post-COVID, that makes that especially dangerous. It's tied back to what I said at the beginning. We need transparent risk. We need democratic negotiations so that we can be in control of our own lives, because we're obviously the people that are suffering the most here. So comparatively, even if opening proves that like this QE like prevents collapse and that it boosts short-term growth, if we can prove that this dominance removes the democratic mechanism that allows societies to adapt, that allows societies to reform,
means on the metrics of how exactly you are able to deliver value for these businesses, you're more likely to arrive at it from our side, which I'm going to show you. I think lastly, when OG says, oh, their prime example is Singapore. Understand how Singapore, in the best case scenario, wasn't really affected by COVID in itself. Understand how it's a small nation, then means the impact to the economy are things that are relatively lesser compared to other nations like Nigeria, nations like India, nations like the United States of America. But I think the last thing to then say in response to CG is that quantitative easing is just an economic tool, and it is based on emergencies, right? So you cannot build your whole case on saying, in principle, that anything done on an emergency is something that is null and void. Understand that the info slide clearly shows us that these particular decisions are made in the instance where things like standard rate cuts are no longer effective. It means all other methods has been tried and found to be not working, right, or not proximate to even arriving at the outcomes that we necessarily want. I think you guys need to do better. We are going to show you two things in terms of extension. First, understand how the problem on government's bench is that they assume that quantitative easing is always and will always be done badly. I think there are two things we need to note on that. Firstly, what exactly is quantitative easing perceived as bad? I think the main reason why quantitative easing is perceived as bad and why we still see that something that is wrong is because of reckless policies by the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Feds in the United States of America that made them give things like subprime mortgages to or bailouts to industries that necessarily were not fulfilling on their obligations, right? Even in Argentina as well, as a result of the fact that you had things like inflation and all those kind of things, and for them to even stabilize their economies, they necessarily had to do all those things. I think secondly, understand how since 2008, right, the period of that very, very big economic clash, understand how quantitative easing has been done by many countries around the world, but we haven't had a depression, we haven't had that level of economic recession. Why? Because you now have an increase in things like data, you now have an increase in things like access, right, to technology. It means
POI.
countries in the future, even now, have an incentive to even do quantitative easing better. I think second thing to then engage is why exactly quantitative easing is a dominant tool, which exactly isn't engaged, right? Secondly, why it is good. I think there are three things to see on this. First, understand how it is a comparative, like the comparative to central banks doing things like buying bonds and private firms like BlackRock, like is what you get with quantitative easing, right? Which is more new imperialistic and is more harmful in the long run because these nations are then less
POI.
accountable to their own people. Because in the instance where you do not fund your own debt or buy your own bonds locally, you're more likely going to have a BlackRock come in and even buy those things, right? So it means their ability to even control the nation, right, through their proxy friends are things that are more likely in your own side of the world. I think something to then say on the comparative is debt financing. These are bigger alternatives that OG and CG do not talk about as their counterfactual. Understand how debt financing in itself is bad for nations. Why? Because there's an active move for de-dollarization. So in the instance where you still want to rejig your local economy, and the only option for you to is to
POI.
go to institutions like the World Bank and all those kind of things. Understand how it then hampers your move to even de-dollarize and dictator from the United States dollar and all the impact that it then has on your economy. Yeah, I'll take that to POI now.
At best, in the best case scenario, this is a regret motion where both sides have harms and they have benefits. Why is your world better than the counterfactual we give you because also fails to do that? They just do a shady job as trying to co-opt our case.
Yeah, so I think our world is better because we show you why QE, quantitative easing, thirdly, is relatively easier to access. But I think lastly, because the counterfactual which you guys preferred are things that are more likely to fail in the world where economic stabilization is something that you never get. Understand how our case is a priori what you get from your side of the world. I think the last thing to then tell you is that in the future, quantitative easing is likely to be done better. Why? Because number one, understand how increased data that exists with things like central banks and the government means they are more likely to even allocate to businesses and the poor who even need it the more. Case in point is, yeah, China with their targeted liquidity approach. So in China, what they currently do, they don't just give that blanket quantitative easing. They actually target the poor of the poor, the vulnerable businesses, and actually give them funds that will enable them to grow. But secondly, because of global economic locking, which makes it a means of last resort. So it's not that, oh, central banks will just irrationally at every beck and call go and quantitative ease because they know that they're still accountable to international organizations like the IFA and all those kind of things. So it means it then exists as a means of last resort, which is more proximate because the comparative aspect are things that are the main crux of today's debate. Why exactly do we not regret it? Why exactly do we not regret it? Number one, for survival. Understand how for local industries to thrive, they have to survive. Understand how quantitative easing has been the mechanism to achieve this. It would also be the tool for countries that do not have that ability to even pay things like high interest rates at the point where they do things like debt financing, right, to even access those kind of funding. But I think secondly, your ability to even arrive at better impacts faster, e.g., businesses on the ground who can then get funding, who can then get liquidity to even scale and expand their operations internationally means as a nation state, you are more proximate to even arriving at good impacts. But I think the last thing to then say is why we over our opening. Number one, understand how OO argues in like the pre and the within the COVID era. We show you why quantitative easing is still a good tool even in the future, thereby meeting the burden in place or the burden that was placed on that debate by OG saying, oh, how exactly is it good in the future. I think lastly, vulnerable countries are then better off crowds to oppose.
Awesome. Our thanks and excuses, member of opposition, for those remarks. That brings an end to the substantive portion of the debate. And now to close the case for side government, Government Whip, whenever you're ready. Here.
Hi, sorry, just trying to find a page and then I'll be ready.
Yep, that's okay.
Okay. I will be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. We are better than anyone else on this bench because we understand two things. One, that this has to be a strategy that is dominant after an emergency like COVID. We're just using COVID as an anchor, but the analysis applies as a post-emergency strategy. And two, fatally, for like all benches, we provide actual alternatives to be used as post strategies. We're the only ones that engage with this on a macroeconomic and a democratic level. You have to take our side. Our impacts are too large. I'll read you the info slide. It's not that this is going to be a strategy, as CEO tries to claim, when everything else has failed. It's simply when standard rate cuts have failed. That just means that the central bank has tried to lower the repo rate as a means of trying to lower the interest rate so things are cheaper for people as a result of them like buying other assets like government bonds or whatever. That doesn't necessarily contradict any of our strategies that we give you. Look at how tax deferrals is a really good system for Russia to use to help entrepreneurs build their society after the effects of the USSR collapsing. Now they are like a relatively strong economy pre-war, I guess. But that was one of the strategies that is good to use. Look at all of Iman's other strategies like fiscal policies, etc. These are things that we bring to you on our side that don't have to be dominant. I think then CEO takes an automatic fourth the moment that they concede within their speech that this is a means of last resort. That's actually not what you're meant to defend. This is meant to be a dominant strategy, i.e. it is literally the strategy that all central banks are using, not as a last resort, but just because they used it in COVID and they kept it after COVID. That is what they have to defend. That's literally why they're losing. We already give you enough analysis about why we're better than OG, so I'll leave that more towards the end. Let's respond to some other claims from OO, and then I'll get into CEO, and then I'll show you why we're better than OG. First of all, OO's case is entirely contingent on this idea that we should keep doing this dominant strategy of quantitative easing because it prevents the economy from collapsing. The analysis here becomes that they give this money from quantitative easing back to the people, that they give it especially to vulnerable people like the poor in the economy, and therefore it promotes like investor confidence. I'll win you on that own metric. First of all, that's actually just not how it works. The central bank buys government bonds, which I'm telling you now, like assets in the form of government bonds from foreign like governments, which tells you that this is risky. If you paid attention to round 5, you'll know that government bonds are far more volatile than equities because it's so susceptible to countries just like randomly doing things outside of your control. Like if a president tweets a slur on Twitter, all of a sudden your bonds crash, right? But also, beyond that, the reason why bonds become so volatile is that there's no books, right? This means that they are already buying assets and spending money that they don't necessarily have on assets that are already volatile. This puts central banks historically, even post-COVID, in weak like positions. This doesn't mean that they're inherently going to collapse. It just puts them in a really vulnerable and weak situation. We regret being put in that situation in the first place. This also lowers investor confidence. If you are just like basing your economy off of bonds, nobody's going to want to invest in you. We'll show you how in the comparative we get that better, but I'll tell you here like a few examples for why like the economy is collapsing on their side. After COVID, Japan's interest rates have been at an all-time low because of quantitative easing and remain at an all-time low. This means that people actually can't uplift themselves. The poor can't uplift themselves because other people are taking away their assets, that other investors or other people are coming in and like debasing their own economy. Think about how the housing crisis in the UK has also significantly and dramatically become less accessible, especially for vulnerable members of society. Look at the Labour Party saying that this was a direct result of quantitative easing post-COVID. These are undeniable examples that show you that the economy actually does worsen and does become more inaccessible to people after COVID. OO's case cannot win. But I'll show you how we get investor confidence on our side. Look at how one of our dominant strategies as the central bank can do that has nothing to do with cutting standard rates is just simply investing the money that they are printing rather than in foreign assets and bonds, putting it directly into their own supply chains, a la Russia with their entrepreneurs, and investing into critical supply chains that are actually needing money and needing resources to survive and thrive after emergencies, yes, but also in situations where there still might be staggered effects of those emergencies. We're the only case that actually deals with these kinds of people in these kind of situations, quantitative easing doesn't make that easier. Note how quantitative easing have from all these like assets into banks. That doesn't mean that banks will suddenly be like, oh, we should give all poor people money in times after emergencies. They have no incentives to do that because banks are very short, like banks are very future thinking. If they are not currently in an emergency, they actually have no incentive to suddenly open up participation for the poor in the society. You can't actually point to me an example post-COVID where that happens, as in after the emergencies of COVID, because banks don't simply do that. So already on our analysis and our comparative, we're doing better than OO. Why are we better than CO? CO just gives a few reasons. They say that we are okay with businesses not necessary, like government bench is okay with businesses not competing globally. I don't see how on their side quantitative easing promotes, especially small businesses. This also directly is just stolen from OO. I don't see how then that this automatically shows you that small businesses will suddenly get better with quantitative easing. No small businesses have gotten a lick of that money because of quantitative easing. On the comparative, at the worst case scenario, our strategies are just symmetric because we can give banks more fiat to give loans. But on their side, the condition for small businesses to get money is on loans. We tell them when we invest in critical supply chains, we're far better macroeconomic level. But we also tell you that we also tell you that like when CEO says that we haven't had this level of recession before, fine. Quantitative easing is good to use during COVID, but in the the laggard effects of COVID, as in like where we are now, that isn't necessarily a good OG. OG only really tells you about how likely to collapse and that we invest in skills and infrastructure. They don't really show you analytically how they get this, especially how they're going to get better skills and infrastructure. We comparatively do. The more that you invest in your people, the more that you have fiscal policies for the people, the more that people and governments can actually and how their situations can improve. Not only do we get that, but we get better democracy, we get a better economy on a macroeconomic and a democratic level. We completely sweep this debate, side with CG.
Cool. House thanks and excuses the government whip for those remarks. And now to bring an end to the opposition case and this debate as a whole, we'd like to invite to the floor the chief whip here.
All right, so checking to see if I'm audible. Just trying to confirm audibility.
Yep, you're audible.
All right, okay, so that's cool. Hi everyone, Heritage here. I'll be the opposition whip for today's debate. Please, if you have a POI, just unmute and say POI. I would really want to take you. If I'm tell you to wait, and when I'm ready, I think I'm going to take you. Okay, so that being said, I will begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. All right, so panel, first thing, very quick responses to CG based on the argumentation the order later in my speech. Okay, so these guys come to tell you that they handle this debate on a demo. We naturally do not think this is true. Why do we think this is not true? We think the ability to use QE is something that was democratically delegated to the government in things like elections. So you understand that probably the government naturally needs to take certain drastic effects to be able to stabilize the economy. You have it in the state principle. You have to protect citizens. Or you are definitely allowed to, pursue other alternatives that naturally doesn't allow you you to way is bad. The problem is that in most cases, the way it has been implemented or the implementation is bad. Understand, panel, that Kiwi is the only system that allows the government to be able to, bypass certain bureaucratic processes to generate liquidity as quickly as possible. There is no other alternatives for these things. And again, that inherently is not how your case was built. Even your closing government points this house. I think you should have done better an analysis in your case. Now, down to CG that actually concedes to the fact that this is as a result of much more weight. Down to CG that actually consider this as a result of much more structural problems, and then the government resolve these structural problems because they think or because they believe the government has an easy alternative, or because they think the government has a simpler way out. But that would have won them the debate. Number one, again, the alternatives they try to give you, even on their side of the house, are not better off because there's an implicit assumption that they can solve these problems on the get-go, that these problems just magically go away. Even if you quickly shoot up your
to the government to
have drastic falls in the market, even when what you have is a shortcut, like your government whip tries to say. But what it tells you is that, and then generally fix the structural issues that exist in status quo, right? We can come for weak labor continue to fester. The problem that exists with your case is you fail to prove to us meticulously why it is impossible for us to continue use QE and to continue to use QE and still solve all of the grassroots policy issues we have in state. Oh, I feel like this is no brainer at this point, right? There are no sufficient analysis on their part of the world as to why these policies won't eventually be fixed in our world, because that tells you we can continue to my protected time, we can continue to pull out wealth from and see how we are using today's debate panel. Vote CEO. Here.
Oh, House thanks and excuses the chief here for those remarks. That brings okay. Panelists, please join me in the deliberation room. Speakers, it is obviously a closed round, so you will not be receiving any oral adjudication. Please cross the floor and shake hands. Here.
Thanks, guys, for the debate.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks again for the round.